On the 26th of September, I intervened in a general debate on the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate after a number of my constituents in Wycombe had contacted me about proposed plans to introduce voter ID, which they believed to be unnecessary. I'm afraid I fundamentally disagree, and I'm very pleased with the commitments we've entered into as the Conservative Party in our manifesto. At the time then in that intervention, I talked about the scale of unlawful electoral practice in Wycombe, and I promised to apply for this adjournment debate in order to elaborate and to ask what the government will do to combat abuses of our electoral system. I subsequently published an article upon which this speech expands. My objective tonight, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure free and fair, open and lawful elections take place in the UK without cheating. This is about upholding the principle that every entitled voter should have one vote and cast it freely. It is to ensure the proper functioning of our democracy. There can be no question of disenfranchising anyone, nor of constraining legitimate political discourse. However, it is a sad reality that systems of rules are always gamed. It's a sad reality that rules of general and council elections are being gamed today. Evidently, some are happy to cheat to win. Since the legitimacy of political power rests on the consent of the public, expressed at the ballot box, action is now required. Now, since I've already had some foolish and vexatious reaction to my article on this subject, I wish to make it clear up front that the fundamental reason for this debate is to stand with the law-abiding majority across all sections of my diverse constituency, including EU nationals and people of Asian descent, against the corruption perpetrated against them by certain individuals. I seek to advance justice and equality for all. Furthermore, I am absolutely confident that the agents of the main political parties in Wycombe conduct their campaigns with an unimpeachable commitment to the integrity of the democratic process. However, despite their integrity, I am clear that rules are being broken by or on behalf of particular individuals. I'd like at this point to pay tribute to the indefatigable zeal of my own agent, Mrs Susan Hynard, who over the period of some 30 years has worked, I think, possibly harder than anyone I could name, possibly as hard as anyone in the country, to ensure not only cross-community politics, but that our elections are conducted in a proper, fair and decent manner that we can all be proud of, and I'm very grateful. I'm sure of the account that I give tonight, Mr Speaker. I could easily identify persons involved under the privileges of this House, but I do not intend tonight to unnecessarily use that privilege. I am aware that by the time evidence has reached me, it is often hearsay. However, what I'm going to say is sourced to a high level of confidence, including, in some cases, to the standard required to make referrals to the police, which has been done. I believe the overwhelming majority of my constituents and people across the country would be shocked if they knew the extent of corrupt election practices and voter fraud, which happen every time there is an election. In Wycombe, we have reason to believe an important council seat held by the Conservatives was lost as a result of corrupt election practices, and we think the extent of corrupt practice could be material in parliamentary elections. So what then do we find is being done? I know of people who register to vote at different addresses in our town and then cast a vote in the same election more than once. In one instance, we can evidence that a man voted once in person and once by postal vote in the same election. My constituents tell me, astonishingly, that people living outside the area will register to vote using friends' and families' addresses in order to support a particular candidate. Mr Speaker, I can understand that some people would want to vote against the Conservative candidate, would want to vote against me, but I do object to people being shipped in to do it. In one case, private data held for legitimate purposes was used to apply for postal votes without the consent of the elector, and then those postal votes were intercepted before the electors had a chance to discover and complete them. That, Mr Speaker, is premeditated theft of votes. The victims would not make a formal complaint for fear of retribution. I am disgusted that to think that today's system of postal voting should facilitate something so redolent of the old rotten boroughs. We also know of landlords who register to vote at properties which they own but where they do not reside. When we look at the register, I will give way to him just one moment, if I may. When we look at the register, we need not be presumptuous about these people and the relations they have with the occupants of the same property. Because when we look at the names, we often know the people involved. I'm well aware it's not an offence to be registered at 2 addresses, and in specimen cases where people can be shown to have voted twice, we've reported them, but no prosecutions have followed. And I'm glad to give way.
Jim Shannon. First of all, it's always a pleasure to be involved in any adjournment debate, and this is the first one of the season, so obviously I was very keen to come along and support the honourable gentleman for Wycombe, who wants to uphold the honesty and integrity of the electoral practices. Does the honourable member agree that the scheme which allows students in some cases to vote at university and in some cases to vote at home must be reassessed and reviewed? One person, one vote was democracy in the past. One person, one vote is democracy today.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and I hope he won't mind me teasing him a bit to say I'm delighted to see he's intervened in the adjournment debate and that normal service has therefore resumed. He's absolutely right, and he knows that I agree with him. One person, one vote, cast freely. That is the principle of our democracy. I'm slightly reluctant to single out students, although I agree with him that there is also potentially a problem with students voting in 2 locations. The crucial point here is to make sure that people only vote once and that they are prosecuted if they vote twice. But our system should prohibit it. Whether or not we should rule out students and others from registering in 2 locations is something to which I'll be glad to hear the Minister's response. Oh, yeah.
Jim Shannon. In Northern Ireland we've had a number of examples, well orchestrated, well detailed and witnessed, where illegal voting has taken place. The Electoral Commission in Northern Ireland has taken many steps to try and change that and make it more accountable in the process, but there still are examples across Northern Ireland where things go wrong. But I just wanted, does the honourable gentleman agree that when it comes to looking at some of the practices that we have done in Northern Ireland to stop illegal voting, stop people doing this, would be something maybe the Minister could look at and might help the honourable gentleman for Wycombe when it comes to trying to stop it?
I absolutely agree with him, and I think that the government should certainly look extremely closely at the precedent established within the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. Certainly, if it's good enough for Northern Ireland on this subject, then I would think as a starting premise it's good enough for the rest of the nations of the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, we've found foreign nationals on the electoral roll living legally in the United Kingdom, but people who are not nationals of the UK or the Commonwealth, nor are they citizens of the Republic of Ireland or another EU country, but they're on our register to vote. In one case, we were able to establish a man's nationality via Companies House, and he was clearly, from his correspondence, on the electoral roll with the intention of voting in this general election, but of course without an entitlement to do so. I've received accounts of candidates visiting electors' homes, demanding that postal votes are completed in front of them, and then taking them away. We cannot assume that voters enjoy secrecy and freedom when marking a ballot paper at home, I am very sorry to say. Only last week, my agent reported to the police evidence we received of the harvesting of postal votes in favour of a particular candidate. I have testimony of one young woman's unmarked postal vote being taken from her under duress by a relative and handed to a candidate. We learned about it because she told another candidate that she wanted to cancel that postal vote so she could cast it again herself in a different way. What a tragic situation to have descended to. Well, it's an abuse we must not tolerate. There are instances of people impersonating others and voting at polling stations in their place. Again, we know of some of these cases being reported to the police without prosecutions taking place. We've received reports from electors in Wycombe that activists working on behalf of particular candidates have sought to procure votes for as little as £10, a free taxi ride, or a free pizza. This simply cannot go on. As I've previously mentioned in this place, In 2015, my agent and I personally reported one of my own party's council candidates to the police. We told our candidates, both of us, we told our candidates that we would hold them to the highest standards and that we would be the first to report them to the police if we received evidence of corrupt practice, because we will not tolerate it. Though it gave us no pleasure, we did what we said we would do. I know my agent has on other occasions raised specific instances of electoral abuse with both the police and the Electoral Commission. Sadly, prosecutions have not followed. This is a theme which has come up time and again. I'm very keen to hear from my honourable friend, the Minister, why prosecutions are not taking place, if she can tell me. In summary on this section, Mr. Speaker, votes are being cast which ought not to be cast. Votes which ought to be cast are being cast by those who ought not to be casting them. Votes are being cast in particular ways as a result of treating and intimidation, and for various reasons, prosecutions are not forthcoming. This is to say nothing of the truth that votes have significantly different weights in different constituencies, so I say only in passing that, of course, constituency sizes must be equalised, as near as we can, if people's votes are to have political equality. When individual voter registration was introduced, it was expected it would remove the abuse of people registering at addresses where they were not entitled to do so. It does seem it's not working. What then is to be done? Well, the law is often very, very clear. One may not, for example, offer a pizza in return for a vote. However, it is not clear to me that appropriate importance is always attributed to each and every vote and prosecuting offences. I am very clear. When one vote is stolen or otherwise corrupted away, it is not just a pencil mark on a piece of paper. It is the inheritance of a tradition of liberty and equality fought for at great cost and handed down over centuries. If we fail to understand the magnitude of the corruption of even a single vote, then we are a politically bankrupt nation. Our current electoral system has not caught up with growth in the population and the realities of modern life. Our procedures have become somewhat quaint, a point which struck me when I looked at the rules for candidates entering polling stations. They say that you can go in there to check for personations. Well, I know many of my constituents, but not sufficient that I can go into every polling station and have any chance of spotting personation. Our procedures have become somewhat quaint. They seem to me inadequate for the modern age, even though, as a software engineer who looked into it, I would not support the introduction of electronic voting machines, for they too are dangerously corruptible. I'd like my honourable friend, the Minister, to set out what plans she has, perhaps drawing on our manifesto commitments, what plans and procedures she intends to put in place to strengthen the integrity of elections, and in particular to ensure that the electoral roll is an accurate reflection of people's entitlement to vote. I'd like to know what steps she'll take to ensure people only vote once, and that if they vote more than once, they are prosecuted for it, and that prosecution carries meaningful penalties. What steps will the government take to stamp out treating? What steps will the government take to reduce intimidation, in particular in relation to postal votes, even though that may involve curtailing access to postal votes for the law-abiding majority, people who I believe would be shocked and appalled by the things I've set out? I know from my constituents and others that there are objections to voter ID on a suggestion that people might be disenfranchised. Of course we can't disenfranchise anyone, and the government must take appropriate steps. But what will the government do to ensure there's no restriction of the franchise while we ensure that people do identify themselves properly? And of course, Northern Ireland has relevant experience.
Thank you very much. And again, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for being so gracious and allowing interventions. We've already brought Northern Ireland voter ID into place. It is successful. People find that it works. And while initially there may have been some objections to it or concern over it, it's a scheme that works and works well. I would suggest, and I think government has suggested that they're going to commit themselves to this. If they are, it's a good idea. We've done it in Northern Ireland. It's working.
Thank you. I'm grateful. And before I conclude, I'd like to touch briefly on two practices which the law needs to address more fully. I think that they are practices which are not fair game. The first is third-party unregistered campaigners producing sometimes slanderous campaign material with no imprint and no oversight, and without the approval of legitimate campaigns and their agents. The ability to circulate bold, misleading and slanderous statements on social media, often in private and securely, means messages can circulate quickly and widely. As reported by the website Guido Fawkes, a particularly egregious campaign was run in my constituency in support of the Labour candidate, despite not being registered as a third-party campaigner. Others are independently pursuing them, and I wish them Godspeed. But what will the government do on unregistered third-party campaigns? Second, it seems to me quite unjust that we should tolerate candidates with no obvious platform standing in an election with no aim apparent beyond increasing the total budget available to oppose another candidate. With access to the free delivery of literature by the Post Office, a copy of the electoral roll and other privileges available to legitimate candidates. If this principle is allowed, this principle of standing candidates simply to expand the budget available to oppose possibly the incumbent, as one of my colleagues at least would attest, if that is allowed, then the trajectory towards every candidate running one or more shadow candidates in their support is both obvious and very, very obviously undesirable. Other practices have gone on which I find extremely distasteful. But I don't want to go on about them tonight because I don't think they should be objects of the law. I'll leave them for another day, in particular in relation to the general standard of political campaigning. I wish tonight to focus on the matters that I've raised. So to conclude, Mr. Speaker, John Stuart Mill, that great beacon of liberal thinkers on political and social theory, and most famously on liberty, said in 1867, "Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion." I'll start that one again. "Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing." Tonight, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking on and I'm doing something. I'm saying to my honourable friend, who I'm hoping and expecting agrees with me on all these issues, I'm saying to the government that in a peaceful society, one governed by the rule of law, the ultimate tool that we have to restrain the use of power in our lives, to give consent to it, is our vote. Political equality and a free and fair ballot are fundamental prerequisites to living in a free society. That is what is at stake in this debate. A great deal was said in my constituency during this general election campaign about cleaning up politics. Well, Mr. Speaker, a very good place to start is ensuring, as my honourable friend opposite said earlier, that one entitled person casts one vote freely and in secrecy.
Minister Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I, in starting, say what a pleasure it is to speak for the first time under your chairmanship, Mr. Speaker, and may I wish you many happy years in that role, as well as the Merry Christmas that you have wished to all in this chamber and all who work here. I welcome my honourable friend's work in coming here tonight to speak on this vital issue, and he is right that I do largely agree with him, so I hope to be able to be helpful to him now in setting out things that the government is doing to address these extremely important matters. He has given, my honourable friend has given, a very, very clear account of the unacceptable behaviour he has observed, and I pay tribute to his work and that of his team in taking the right action, namely in reporting his and his constituents' concerns to the right authorities for investigation. He rightly seeks, my honourable friend rightly seeks to support the law-abiding majority in his actions. So do I, and so does the government, and I will go on to talk chiefly about the problem of electoral fraud here tonight. I will just briefly touch upon two of the other issues that he raised towards the end of his remarks, though, namely the relatively newer issues of unregistered third-party campaigning and shadow candidacy, to borrow his phrase. The second of those I have heard from a couple of honourable members in respect of the election just past, and what I would say is that I would welcome hearing any experience of any honourable member across this House that believes they have seen something untoward at the election just past, and I would be keen to hear of those experiences and consider what could be done. On the subject of unregistered third-party campaigners, I would direct my honourable friend to the work that is emerging on so-called digital imprints. Now, this is, as the name suggests, a way of transferring what we do on paper literature to literature online. It rather does what it says on the tin, but it's very, very important because actually this is quite understandably where we nowadays get across a lot of our messages and receive those messages, and people, voters, expect to have political interaction online, quite rightly, but that should be done in an accountable way. And so what we're seeking to do there is extend the regulations covering identification of the campaigner to the online sphere from where it currently exists offline. The government will be coming forward shortly with more detail on that, which I think will be of interest to my honourable friend. Let me turn now then to electoral fraud, and I entirely agree with my honourable friend that this is a pernicious crime that should not be ignored, and those who seek to ignore it are condoning it and are very unwise to do that. People deserve to have confidence in our democracy, and people expect that crime will be punished. Victims, indeed, of electoral fraud deserve that support too. So there is no complacency at all on this side of the House, nor indeed in the Honourable Gentleman's Party of the Democratic Unionist Party, about the importance of tackling those vulnerabilities in the electoral system to fraud, and that might be, whether that might be from those who vote in person or those who abuse the option of voting by post or by proxy. I can reassure my honourable friend and his constituents in Wycombe that we will be bringing forward measures that will improve the integrity and security of each elector's vote, whether that be at a polling station or remotely. These measures to strengthen the security of our voting are part of a much wider initiative to improve the trust that we can all have in the integrity of our democracy. We seek to maintain public confidence and to support, of course, inclusivity and equality in our electoral system. And my honourable friend is quite right to draw on that ancient concept of equality in voting rights and equality in an election. So as part of this, the government is committed to introducing voter ID, as we call it, so measures asking voters to show an approved form of photographic ID in order to vote at a polling station. This will be at a UK parliamentary election in Great Britain because, of course, it already takes place in Northern Ireland. And we have been piloting this at local elections in England to be ready ahead of the next general election. These are common sense measures, Mr. Speaker, because my honourable friend describes exactly the types of behaviour that expose, not just in Wycombe, but arguably across the UK, anywhere in our democracy, the undeniable potential for electoral fraud and the perception of this, which indeed in itself undermines confidence in our democracy. So showing ID is something that people of all backgrounds do every day, whether it's taking out a library book, claiming benefits, in fact, picking up a parcel from the post office. Proving you who you are before you come to make a decision of huge importance at the ballot box should be no different. And people I have spoken to about this measure extensively agree that this is an entirely common sense approach, and indeed many are surprised that we don't already have to do it. I give way.
Yes, again, thank you very much for giving way. It's a pleasure to do so. Can I just say this? In Northern Ireland, when we put in the voter ID system, it's a photographic identification. Some people have licences, some people have passports, but some people have neither. Maybe have a bus pass, maybe a firearm certificate or something. But government set down a system whereby people were able to apply to get an ID photograph done through government themselves and through the body responsible. So there are ways of making this scheme work, even for those who may find it difficult.
My honourable friend is absolutely correct on this, and I can confirm that at the pilots we have run, we have made sure it is the case that anybody who is lacking the specified form of ID has been able to apply free of charge, Mr. Speaker, for a local electoral ID from their local authority. And indeed we have heard of cases where this has proved hugely valuable in individuals' lives for reasons other than elections, because they now have a form of official ID that has been possible to use. I could point to a really a really heartwarming example of a number of homeless individuals in Woking during one of the pilots last year. So that measure in itself ensures that everybody who is eligible to vote has the opportunity to do so, and I think that is fundamental. I would also point, actually, whilst I'm on the subject of this, that other countries do this already. You look at Austria, you look at Canada, you look at the Netherlands. There are clear examples from around the globe of where this is a normal part of the voting process. And we can see also in the evaluation of the pilots that we've done that this is a success for the public, and that there is a higher public confidence in elections in the voter ID pilot areas, which I think is very important. The Electoral Commission found a notable decrease in the number of people worried about the integrity of our elections when voter ID was in place. And this returns to the core point that if the public has confidence in our elections, they're more likely to take part in that, and that is what we would all want to see happening. Our evaluations also show that the huge majority of electors who came to vote did so with the right documents and confidence in knowing how to. So based on those evaluations, we can also say that there is no indication that any particular demographic was adversely affected by those voter ID models, which I'm sure is something that the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, will use to reassure any remaining of his constituents who might be interested in the details of how such a scheme works. I can also reassure the House that voter ID is backed by a range of third-party organisations, the Electoral Commission, but also international election observers, such as the OSCE and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, who are repeatedly calling for its introduction, which I think is important. Now, my honourable friend, as I've said, is so right about the importance of tackling electoral fraud that I am very sad to hear that other parties in this House are not supportive of doing so, and I think that is an argument that we will want to take up again in this place another time. The next steps here, Mr. Speaker, are that the government will be continuing to work with local authorities across the UK, as well as with those who piloted voter ID at the local elections in 2018 and 19, to make sure that this works successfully for all voters. And I would be delighted if Wycombe were a council that wanted to take part in that in the future.
I'm very grateful. I think I can certainly assure my honourable friend that I'll give her every support to make Wycombe a pilot for voter ID. But since I'm on my feet, can I just also press her on the other point, which is that a voter might conceivably correctly identify themselves and yet still vote twice. I can think of ways, which I won't elaborate now, to check that without establishing a single giant database. But what steps will the government take to make sure that people don't vote twice, and if they do, they're prosecuted?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for sharpening the point here about voting twice. There's a couple of senses of this which I was going to come on to in my remarks. I will first of all give him the reassurance of something we're doing that goes by the name of canvass reform. Now, this is deep into the technicalities of how elections run, Mr. Speaker, but this is what we all value in this place. And I would ask my honourable friend to take a look at this, because there he will find new practices of data matching used by local authorities to check for people's entitlement to register to vote, and of course that is preceded by working out who is in each household. That is the point of the annual canvass, as my honourable friend will know. So there are a number of steps in that process which is being reformed to make sure that we are allowing registration officers to focus their resources where it's needed the most, and we think of that mostly in terms of helping those who if you like, are least easy to find, to invite to apply to register to vote. This is about fulfilling the duty of registration officers, which is to encourage everybody to register to vote. So, of course, it's right that they should focus their resources where that's most needed, instead of following cumbersome processes that are otherwise defined in the electoral law. But I think for the purposes of this argument, there is also an extra merit here, which is that data can publicly held data sets can increasingly be used to better understand voters in a given area and to perhaps look into some of the issues that he is touching on in his arguments. I'd also like to say, Mr. Speaker, that voter ID is not the only step we are taking. Honourable members might well be aware of the Pickles report into electoral fraud, and there is much to do to implement the recommendations of that. We are partway through doing so. There you will find the government's commitment to working on matters such as undue influence and updating the law there, which again is relevant to some points that my honourable friend made. We will also be looking at postal and proxy voting as part of this. So we intend to ban political campaigners from handling postal votes, and we will also establish a requirement on those that are registered for a postal vote to reapply every 3 years, as currently registration can last indefinitely. We will limit the number of proxy votes that a person may exercise to no more than 2 per elector, regardless of their relationship with the voter for whom they are voting. On this point, may I highlight the bill introduced by my honourable friend, the member for Southport, who did very great work. I'm not sure he is here with us tonight, Mr. Speaker. I spoke to him only this afternoon about this. He did this in the previous session, and it was an excellent bill, Mr. Speaker, because it made provision to ban political campaigners from handling another voter's postal vote, and to introduce that limit on the number of postal ballots that anybody may hand in on behalf of other voters at a polling station or to a returning officer on polling day. And these are all known vulnerabilities, if I may express it that way, in the system that we seek to remove. So I pay tribute to his work on that important issue. That bill did not complete its parliamentary stages, but there is a lot more to do, and we in the government are committed to building upon that, in particular to stop the harvesting of postal votes at elections. Now, I want to come on to enforcement, because of course this is I think a core part of the concern that my honourable friend is articulating here tonight. I think he will understand that I won't be in a position to comment on the particular evidence and cases that he has referred to, but I can give him reassurance that there is much work going on to look at consistency and enforcement across the country. And I will also start by saying that I want to do more of this, because evidently when an honourable member comes with stories as he has done tonight, this work is not complete, so it must go on. Now, there are regular meetings that take place between myself, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister for the Constitution, and the Electoral Commission and the Police Chiefs Council. That is one forum that we use to try to achieve consistency and the review of systemic issues, and if there were any elements of my honourable friend's presentation tonight that he thinks I ought to raise in that forum, I would be happy to hear them. We also, in the Cabinet Office, have been working closely with the Electoral Commission to run a very large awareness campaign. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. All of these activities of the autumn is taking its toll on my voice. Thank goodness it is Christmas very shortly, where I'll be able to cease speaking.
I'm grateful. You mentioned awareness. I think one of the problems we've got here is that people are all too aware of the vulnerabilities in the system. I mean, one man I could name, who, just for the sake of clarity, is an Irishman. I'm not going to name any further than that. He's so obviously guilty of voting once by postal vote and once in person. I could name him outside the House and be confident I wouldn't be sued. And yet he wasn't prosecuted when we put the evidence out there. So I'm very keen that we actually fine people. Jail them if they're really repeat offenders, because they do know what they know what the vulnerabilities are, and they're exploiting them. I was shown evidence earlier today of somebody boasting in a WhatsApp group of having driven 2.5 hours to vote against me from his home where he'd already voted. I mean, this cannot go on.
Yes, yes, Mr. Speaker, I entirely agree with my honourable friend on the gravity of this situation, and whilst I hear that he makes the point about penalties that may follow when evidence is presented, I will just complete the point I was just coming on to make, actually, which is that it is nonetheless important to encourage the victims of this crime to speak up as well. So it is excellent that my honourable friend and others are playing their part by raising such evidence, but it is also important that actually we do that. We do help victims to do so, and even better, to not be a victim in the first place of such fraud by knowing that their vote is theirs alone. And that was the strapline of the awareness campaign that I'm referring to. There is a lot more to do, as I say, on this point. There is much work that I think can be done to help the Electoral Commission and the police and local authorities get on top of this where evidence is raised, and I am very keen to offer that commitment to the offer the commitment to the House, Mr. Speaker, that if any member wishes to raise such issues with me, I would very much like to take that as a portfolio of evidence and anecdotes and observations that I might be able to use to take that work forwards. There's also, of course, some very granular ways that we can target this kind of behaviour. For example, I think it's very sensible that now police community support officers are allowed into polling stations by law, which means that there are police available to tackle issues on polling day should that be identified. Now, I did already mention canvass reform earlier on, and the ways in which registration officers are able to use data better than the past. Also, I think there might be a pointer to give my honourable friend about the system of individual electoral registration. I don't know the dates of all of the issues that he has raised. It is possible, perhaps, that some of his points go back some years, which might predate the introduction of IER. I am absolutely confident my honourable friend has looked into this very carefully and knows exactly what I am driving at here. But the point is this, that actually we do value in our system that an individual should be responsible for their registration, as opposed to somebody being able to register them for them, let alone register them without their own consent, which is a further point that I note my honourable friend made. Let me also just come on to a final point about double voting, which he also referred to. One thing that I heard concerns about following the last election, was the 2017 election, Mr. Speaker, was that there appeared to be some evidence that certain groups had been perhaps engaging in double voting. And this was a common thing said by honourable members after that election. What my predecessor and I undertook to do was to take all such allegations and seek for them to be investigated in a coordinated way by that cooperation between the Electoral Commission and the Police Chiefs Council. I would be very keen to do so again if there is a weight of those, if there is a weight of those observations, perhaps running as high as allegations. And as I say, Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to hear such things from any colleagues if they perceive that there is something that needs to be investigated at a systemic level. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the government is absolutely committed to strengthening the integrity of our electoral system. We think this is vital because the public ought to have confidence that our elections are secure and are fit for the 21st century. If people are confident in our democracy, then they are more likely to participate in it, and all the benefits that my honourable friend has so meticulously laid out tonight can flow in that we know our democracy is doing its job. So the measures that we are looking to achieve, Mr. Speaker, which will flow in in this Parliament, we hope, will provide greater security for everybody, whether you vote in person, whether you vote by post or by proxy. We think this is a job to do on the side of voters, not on the side of those who wish to corrupt democracy. And we also think very, very strongly that we should not be taking our democracy for granted in any way. So our work to protect and promote and strengthen our democracy is never done. People do deserve to have that confidence. And indeed, as the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, said earlier today, in this place, this is a moment of great democratic importance. It is a moment to repay the trust of those who have sent us here, deliver on their priorities, and ensure that our democracy thrives from here onwards.